In the middle of a university lecture, Professor Clara Whitmore stopped mid-sentence and turned toward the janitor standing near the door. She called him by name Adrian Cole and told him to come solve the equation written on the board. The students laughed. Some exchanged glances. None of them took it seriously. But the equation on that board had been deliberately written wrong. When Adrian picked up the chalk and went still at the second line, every sound in that room disappeared. Whatever came next, nothing would be the same. Harwick University had been standing for over 140 years, and it looked every bit of it. The stone corridors were narrow. The ceilings vaulted the walls, lined with portraits of men in dark academic robes who seemed to be watching everything and approving of very little. It was the kind of institution where pedigree mattered, where faculty titles carried weight, and where the distance between a professor and a janitor was not simply a matter of salary. It was treated like a law of nature, something fixed and unquestioned. Clara Whitmore had been teaching advanced mathematics at Harwick for 11 years. She held 2 graduate degrees, had published in 4 peer-reviewed journals, and ran her lectures the way a conductor runs an orchestra, with precision, with authority, and with very little patience for anything that disrupted her tempo. She was sharp in the way that cut without drawing attention to the blade, and she had a particular gift for making people feel they were exactly where they belonged, which, in her world, meant she belonged at the front of the room, and everyone else belonged in the seats. Adrian Cole had been working the maintenance crew at Harwick for 3 years. He took the overnight shift when he could get it, and the early morning shift when he couldn't. By the time most faculty arrived at 8 in the morning, he had already been on campus for 4 hours, mopping hallways, restocking supply closets, wiping down whiteboards in classrooms that would be full of students within the hour. He was 35, quiet in a way that was easy to mistake for emptiness, and most people on campus could not have told you his name without checking a staff directory. He moved through the building like a fixture, present, functional, and visible. That particular morning, he was wiping down the board in Lecture Hall C when Clara's students began filing in. He had planned to finish and be gone before the room filled up. He didn't make it. Clara arrived exactly on time, set her materials on the desk, and started speaking before she had even fully removed her coat. Adrian moved toward the side of the room, trying to stay out of the way, the eraser cloth still in his hand. The equation Clara wrote on the board was long 3 rows of notation, dense and deliberate, the kind that graduate students might slow down to read twice. She walked the class through the first line without looking up, then asked them to follow the logic into the second. The room was attentive in that particular way that comes not from interest, but from mild fear of being called on. Nobody volunteered answers. Everyone waited to be chosen. It was while she was mid-sentence, explaining a property in the second row, that she turned and looked directly at Adrian. He was near the door, moving quietly, trying to exit without disrupting anything. She called his name, not loudly, just clearly. Adrian. The way she said it had the same flat authority she used on students, who were slow to respond. He stopped. Every head in the room turned toward him, and the shift was immediate, a change in pressure, the way air changes before weather. Clara gestured toward the board. She told him the equation was a standard one, something anyone could work through, and asked him to come up and finish solving it from the second line forward. Her tone was composed, almost pleasant. That was the most unsettling part of it. There was no visible cruelty in it, just a quiet certainty that what she was doing was perfectly reasonable. 32 students watched. A few of them looked at each other. Someone in the back row made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't far from one either. Adrian didn't move right away. He looked at the board from where he was standing. The equation was written in Clara's handwriting, clean, precise, and at first glance, it looked like a standard differential, the kind used in undergraduate coursework. But something in the second row didn't track. A sign had been inverted in a way that changed the entire structure of the expression. It wasn't the kind of mistake that happened when someone wrote too fast. The notation around it was too careful, too deliberate. The error sat in the middle of otherwise meticulous work, like something that had been placed there. He walked to the front of the room. Someone in the third row laughed outright, a short, sharp sound. Another student whispered something to the person beside them. Clara stood to the side of the board, with her arms crossed, watching him with the particular expression of someone who has already decided what is about to happen. Adrian picked up the chalk and read through the equation from the beginning. He did not write anything yet. The room had gone through its initial amusement and landed somewhere slightly different, not silence exactly, but the kind of collective stillness that comes when something unexpected is taking longer than expected. The students who had laughed were no longer laughing. Clara's expression had not changed, but her stillness had a different quality to it. Now the stillness of someone waiting for a specific outcome. Adrian knew what the correct move was, by every social logic available to him in that room. Solve the equation as written, get the wrong answer, and exit quietly. He was a janitor standing at the front of a university lecture hall with chalk in his hand, while 32 students waited to see him fail. The room had a script, and his role in it was already written. He chose not to follow it. Adrian set the chalk to the board, and instead of continuing from the second line, he went back to it. He rewrote the expression. He corrected the inverted sign. Then he worked forward from there, moving through the remaining steps with the kind of steadiness that does not perform itself, that simply exists. His handwriting was not elegant, but it was exact. He did not explain what he was doing or why he had gone back. He simply solved the equation as it should have been written and set the chalk down when he was finished. The room processed what it had just seen in stages. First came confusion, several students leaning forward, looking from Adrian's work to what Clara had originally written, trying to understand the discrepancy. Then came the realization moving through the room in a quiet ripple. The equation on the board had been wrong, and the janitor had corrected it. Clara's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible. A tightening around the eyes, a fractional change in her posture. She looked at the board, then she looked at Adrian. Whatever she had anticipated from this moment, it was not this. Adrian set the eraser cloth back in its tray. He looked at Clara once, not with defiance, not with apology, and then turned to leave. He had not said a single word the entire time. When the noise came, it came all at once. Students talking over each other, a few laughing, but differently now, uncertain, not quite sure what they had just witnessed. Clara's voice cut through all of it. She told the class to quiet down, said that what had happened was a disruption, and that they were going to return to the lecture. Her voice was even. It gave nothing away. But the equation Adrian had written was still on the board, and she did not erase it. That detail would matter later. In the moment, Adrian walked out into the corridor and pulled the door shut behind him. The hallway was empty. Fluorescent lights ran the length of the ceiling in a long, unbroken line. He picked up the mop he had left leaning against the wall and walked toward the next room on his list. He had 4 more classrooms before his shift ended. The formal complaint arrived at the maintenance office before Adrian's shift ended. It was printed on department letterhead signed by Clara Whitmore and described his behavior during her lecture as an unauthorized interference with academic instruction. The language was precise in the way that institutional language is always precise. Clinical impersonal, designed to make one specific thing sound like a category of offense. The department supervisor, a tired man named Walt, who had been managing facilities staff for over 2 decades, read it twice, and then looked at Adrian across the desk with an expression that was more exhausted than accusatory. Walt told him to keep his head down. He said it the way people say things they believe are practical advice, and not what they actually are, which is a quiet instruction to accept a version of events that isn't entirely true. Adrian did not argue. He signed the acknowledgement form, which stated that he understood the complaint had been filed and that any further disruption of academic activities would result in disciplinary review. Then he walked back out into the corridor and finished his shift. What Adrian did not know was that there had been someone else in Lecture Hall C that morning who did not belong to Clara's class. Dr. Leonard Hayes had arrived at Harwick 2 days earlier as a visiting scholar from a university in the Pacific Northwest. He was there to review the mathematics department's graduate curriculum as part of an external assessment the university had commissioned. He had slipped into the back of Clara's lecture without announcing himself, a habit he had when reviewing departments, preferring to observe before introducing himself formally. He sat in the last row, and he saw everything. Leonard was not a man who reached conclusions quickly. On the morning in question, he had watched Clara write the equation on the board, watched her call the janitor forward, and watched Adrian correct the second line before solving the rest without a word. He had not laughed when the students laughed. He had taken out his notebook and written down the original equation as Clara had written it, then written down what Adrian had changed. By the time the lecture resumed, Leonard had already worked through both versions in the margins of the page. The original was wrong. Not in the way that a rushed calculation goes wrong, not a transposed digit or a dropped variable. The error was structural. It sat at a specific inflection point in the derivation, where a sign inversion would produce a result that looked plausible to an untrained eye, but would collapse under any serious application. The surrounding notation was immaculate. An error that precise, placed that carefully. Inside work that clean everywhere else that did not happen by accident. Leonard went to Clara's office that afternoon. She received him with the warmth she extended to any external reviewer, formal, controlled, professionally cordial. When he mentioned the equation, something shifted in her expression very briefly, the way a door shifts when the wind changes direction before it closes again. She told him the error had been intentional, a pedagogical tool designed to test her students' critical attention. The explanation was not unreasonable on its surface. Leonard nodded and did not push further. But on his way out, he asked, as if it were an afterthought, whether she had informed the class in advance that the error was intentional. Clara said the exercise spoke for itself. Leonard said that it certainly had, and left. He found Adrian the following morning in a supply room near the East Corridor stairwell, reordering shelves. Leonard introduced himself directly. Name, title, reason for being at Harwick. Adrian listened without expression. When Leonard asked how he had known the equation was wrong, Adrian said he had just read it. When Leonard asked whether he had studied mathematics formally, Adrian said he had taken some courses and offered nothing else. What Leonard needed to know was whether Adrian understood the position he was now in. When he explained the complaint that had been filed, Adrian responded with a slight nod, the nod of someone who had anticipated this outcome and had simply been waiting for confirmation. Leonard returned to his temporary office and drafted a short written statement, which he submitted to the department chair through official channels. The statement said in precise academic language that he had independently verified the equation in question, that the original as written contained a structural error, and that the correction made by the maintenance staff member during the lecture was mathematically accurate. He attached his workings. The department chair, Dr. Richard Farwell, had held the position for 8 years, and in that time had developed the particular skill set of someone whose primary job is to prevent things from becoming problems. He read Leonard's statement alongside Clara's complaint and understood immediately that both could not be resolved without one of them becoming a problem. He sent Leonard a brief acknowledgement and did not respond further that day. By the end of that week, Clara had done what people in positions of institutional authority often do. When challenged from an unexpected direction, she moved laterally. She did not address the mathematical question directly. Instead, she built a case around conduct. She spoke to 2 members of her department, framing the incident as a violation of classroom protocol, and to someone in facilities management above Walt's level. She described a pattern of an employee who had demonstrated a failure to understand appropriate professional boundaries. There were no other documented incidents. But the language she used was careful enough that the absence of documentation did not immediately surface as the problem it was. Adrian heard none of this directly. What he felt was its effect, the way the atmosphere around him in the building changed in texture. Walt stopped meeting his eyes in the corridor. A colleague on his shift mentioned indirectly that his name had come up in conversations he hadn't been part of. He kept showing up. He did his work. He said very little to anyone. Leonard, for his part, received a visit from Farwell in person. Farwell was cordial, the way administrators are cordial when delivering a message they would prefer not to have to deliver. He said that while Leonard's mathematical assessment was noted, the matter had become a personnel question and was therefore outside the scope of an external curriculum review. He said it would be best if Leonard directed any further observations through formal review channels rather than internal correspondence. It was a polite instruction to stop. Leonard thanked him and said he understood, in the sense that he understood exactly what was happening. That was not the same as intending to accept it. He knew what official channels looked like when they were being used to produce documentation of fairness rather than fairness itself. He also knew that his position as an external reviewer gave him leverage that an internal faculty member would not have. He was temporary, which made him paradoxically harder to manage. Harwick needed his assessment. His signature would go on a report that the university had commissioned and would present to its accreditation body. That report was not yet written. He did not use this directly. He simply did not stop. He continued attending lectures across the department, continued making notes, and on Thursday of that week, he requested access to the full curriculum review materials he had been commissioned to assess which Harwick was contractually obligated to provide. Somewhere in those materials were 2 years of course documentation from Clara's section. Leonard began reading through them, the way he read through everything slowly, methodically, without announcing what he was looking for. The internal meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. The formal notification arrived in Adrian's mailbox near the facilities break room, a joint letter from the Office of Human Resources and the Mathematics Department. It informed him that a review had been initiated regarding his conduct during a faculty lecture and requested his attendance at a meeting with department representatives and HR personnel. The language was neutral in the particular way that institutional language is neutral when the outcome has already been discussed before the meeting takes place. Adrian read the letter in the break room while the coffee machine ran behind him. He read it once and folded it. He had known it was coming. He had known since the moment he picked up that chalk that there would be a cost. In the 3 years he had worked at Harwick, he had learned that institutions do not absorb disruption. They process it, and the processing always runs in the direction of restoring the arrangement that existed before the disruption occurred. He was the disruption. The meeting was the processing. What he had not accounted for was Leonard. He did not know as he sat in the break room with the folded letter in his hand that Leonard Hayes had spent the last 4 days reading through 2 years of course documentation and had found, in 3 separate problem sets from the previous academic year, equations with structural errors in the same position, the same inflection point, the same type of sign inversion as the equation written on the board that morning in Lecture Hall C. He did not know that Leonard had printed those pages and organized them into a folder sitting on his temporary office desk next to a legal pad covered in annotations. He only knew that Monday was coming and that he would have to walk into that room with nothing except what he actually knew and try to make that be enough. The meeting was held in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the administration building, a room with a long oak table, 6 chairs, and windows that faced the interior courtyard where nobody ever sat. Adrian arrived 3 minutes early. He wore the same work clothes he wore every day, and he had decided somewhere between receiving the letter and walking through the door that arriving as something other than what he was would not help him. He sat on one side of the table. Across from him sat Dr. Farwell, an HR representative named Judith Crane, who had a notepad and a pen and said nothing for the first several minutes, and Clara Whitmore, who sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at the space just past Adrian's shoulder rather than at his face. The fourth chair on their side of the table was empty. Farwell explained that the meeting was a preliminary review and not a formal disciplinary hearing, a distinction that was technically accurate and practically meaningless. The purpose, he said, was to give all parties the opportunity to present their understanding of events before the department made any determination. Then he asked Clara to speak first. Clara's account was organized and calm. She described her decision to invite the maintenance worker to participate in a classroom exercise, and described his response as a disruption of that exercise, specifically his alteration of material she had written on the board without her authorization. She used the phrase unilateral interference with curriculum delivery twice. She said that regardless of the mathematical content in question, the conduct itself represented a failure to observe basic professional boundaries, and that this failure in a setting where academic authority needed to be maintained was the issue she was raising. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Adrian directly. Her account took about 8 minutes and left almost no visible opening. Farwell looked at Adrian and asked if he wanted to respond. Adrian said he did. He told them what he had seen on the board and what he had done about it. He used plain language, not because he lacked another register, but because plain language was accurate, and accuracy was what the room needed. He said the equation as written was incorrect, that the error was in the second row at a specific point in the derivation, and that solving it as written would produce a result that was wrong. He said he corrected it before solving it, because presenting an incorrect result to a room full of students seemed to him like the worse of the two available options. He said this without apology and without aggression. He was simply reporting what had happened. In the order it had happened and why. Judith Crane wrote something on her notepad. Farwell glanced at it from the side. Clara's expression had not moved. Adrian could see that his account, however accurate, was moving through the room at a different speed than Clara's. Her version had institutional syntax. His had none. And in rooms like this one, syntax carried weight that content alone did not always compensate for. He knew this. He had known it before he walked in. He kept going anyway. He asked if he could write the equation on the whiteboard at the end of the room. Farwell nodded. Adrian got up, found a marker in the tray, and wrote out the equation as Clara had originally put it on the board. In Lecture Hall C, he had committed it to memory before the meeting, reviewing it that morning until every line was exact. He wrote it cleanly in 3 rows, then circled the point in the second row where the sign inversion appeared. He explained why that inversion changed the structure of the derivation and what result it would produce if the equation were solved as written. He wrote the correct version beside it and showed the difference in the outcome. Then he set the marker down and sat back down. The room was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before he had gotten up. Farwell was looking at the board. Judith Crane had stopped writing. Clara was looking at the board too, and for the first time since the meeting had begun, she was looking at something real rather than past it. The door opened. Everyone at the table turned. Leonard Hayes stood in the doorway holding a manila folder. He addressed Farwell directly. He understood this was not a scheduled appearance. He apologized for the interruption, but said he had information directly relevant to the matter being reviewed and believed it needed to be considered before any determination was made. Farwell's expression moved through several things quickly and settled on something that was not quite welcome, but recognized that turning Leonard away would create its own complications. He gestured to the empty chair. Leonard sat. He opened the folder and placed 3 sets of printed pages on the table, photocopies of problem sets from Clara's coursework in the previous academic year, relevant sections flagged with paper clips. He explained methodically and without editorial comment. What he had found, 3 separate instances in prior course materials, where equations contained structural errors at the same position, the same inflection point, the same type of sign inversion as the equation written on the board in Lecture Hall C. In all 3 cases, the surrounding notation was precise, and the error was isolated. He said he was not in a position to assign intent, but that he was in a position to state, as someone with 30 years in the field, that errors of this specific type, appearing with this specific consistency in this specific position, within otherwise careful work, were not consistent with accidental mistake. He set his own written analysis beside the photocopies, 2 pages single-spaced, with his methodology and conclusions laid out in language that did not leave much room for alternative interpretation. Then he looked at Farwell and said that his formal curriculum review report, which the university had commissioned and which he was scheduled to submit at the end of the following week, would reflect what he had found, and that the report would be a matter of institutional record, regardless of what was decided in this room today. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from any that had come before it. It was the silence of a room recalibrating. Farwell looked at the papers in front of him. Judith Crane had set down her pen entirely. Clara was very still, her hand still folded on the table. But the stillness had changed quality. It was no longer the stillness of someone who controls the room. It was the stillness of someone finding that the available options had narrowed considerably. Farwell looked at Clara and asked if she wanted to respond to Dr. Hayes's findings. When she spoke, her voice had the same even tone it always had, but the content was different. She said that the errors in the prior materials had been identified and corrected in the final versions of the course documents, and that she had intended to update the lecture material in question. She said the exercise had become more complicated than she had anticipated. She did not use the word intentional. She did not use the word trap. But she stopped short of calling it accidental, and in a room where everyone present was capable of reading what language had been chosen and what had been left out, the omission was clear. Farwell said he would need time to review the materials and consult with HR before any determination was issued. He said the meeting was adjourned, set it to the table, rather than to any particular person. People began gathering their things. Leonard closed his folder and stood. Clara picked up her bag and walked to the door without looking at anyone. Adrian remained seated for a moment after the others had moved, not because he was waiting for something, but because he needed a second before he stood up in it. Leonard caught him in the hallway outside. He told Adrian that the mathematical analysis was correct, that he had said so in writing, and that it would stand as part of the official record regardless of what the university decided about the rest of it. Adrian thanked him. Leonard nodded and walked toward the stairwell. That was the entirety of the exchange, and it was enough. The determination arrived 4 days later, delivered to the same slot in the facility's break room. Adrian read it standing up. The complaint filed by Professor Whitmore had been reviewed and found insufficient to support disciplinary action. His conduct during the lecture was not determined to constitute a violation of professional boundaries, as defined by university policy. He was cleared. The file would be closed. He folded the letter, put it in his jacket pocket, and finished his shift. What happened to Clara unfolded over the following weeks, the way professional consequences unfold in institutional settings, not as a single event, but as a series of adjustments that collectively amounted to something significant. Leonard's curriculum review report was submitted on schedule. It cited concerns about the accuracy and consistency of certain course materials in the mathematics department and recommended an independent audit of graduate-level course documentation. The recommendation was accepted. Clara was placed on administrative review while the audit was conducted. She was not immediately dismissed. Institutions rarely move that quickly, but she was removed from lecture duties pending the outcome. Her courses were reassigned, her access to the faculty course portal was restricted, and her name no longer appeared on the upcoming semester's schedule. Within a department of that size, there was no such thing as a private consequence. People knew. Adrian did not know the details. He knew the broad shape of it through things colleagues mentioned, through the way the atmosphere in the building had shifted. He did not feel satisfied by it, in the way satisfaction is usually described. He had not gone into that lecture hall intending to expose anyone. He had picked up the chalk because the equation was wrong, and everything that followed had been the consequence of that one decision made in about 4 seconds, expanding outward into things he had not anticipated and could not fully track. What he noticed in the days after the letter arrived was that people looked at him differently. Not everyone, most of the people who passed him in the corridors were still the same people who had never looked at him at all. But the ones who had been in Lecture Hall C that morning began acknowledging him when they saw him. Some of them just nodded. One of them, a young man from the 3rd row, who had been among the first to laugh, stopped him near the East Wing stairwell and said, with the slightly formal discomfort of someone delivering an apology they had been thinking about longer than they expected, that he thought what Adrian had done took something he wasn't sure he would have had in the same situation. He didn't name what it was. He didn't need to. Adrian thanked him and kept walking because there was another classroom at the end of the hall that needed its board wiped down before the 3 o'clock lecture, and that was what he was there to do. The equation he had written on the conference room whiteboard was still there when the room was used for a department heads meeting 2 days later. Farwell, who arrived early to set up, stood in front of it for a moment before the others came in. He was not a mathematician by training, but he could see the 2 versions side by side, the one with the error and the corrected one, and he could see where they diverged, and that only one of them went somewhere that made sense. He looked at it for a little while. Then he picked up the eraser, wiped the board clean, and set up the chairs for the meeting. Adrian Cole continued working at Harwick. He still arrived early, still moved through the corridors with the same quiet efficiencies, still wiped down boards in classrooms that would fill with students within the hour. The work was the same as it had always been. He was not offered anything else and did not ask for anything else. What had changed was harder to name than a job title or a salary. It lived in the quality of the air when he entered a room, not dramatic, not transformed, but different in the specific way that things are different when the people around you have updated their understanding of who they are actually looking at. He had not asked for that. He had only read an equation, recognized what it was, and chosen not to pretend otherwise. Everything else had followed from that, in all its complicated and uneven consequence, like a derivation working itself forward from the point where someone finally corrected the sign.